So this morning's first panel is especially timely given what's happening with Hurricane Florence and some of the discussions we've been having around Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. 1 year after some of the most devastating hurricanes in recent history, communities across the Caribbean and Virgin Islands are still rebuilding. We must find better paths to disaster response and recovery. By analyzing transaction data, can we help vulnerable cities understand how to help businesses stock appropriately? Can we find ways to ease debt for citizens when they lose everything? Can we help city leaders avoid issues like price gouging at gas pumps? Mastercard has partnered with some of the country's leading minds to study the impact of financial shocks to inform better preparation and ultimately faster recovery and more equitable recovery for communities at risk. Today's panelists will share insights from their work. It's time to bring up our moderator, Lisa Bova-Haight. She is a disaster recovery consultant from Witt O'Brien's. She's also the former executive director of the New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, where she managed a budget of $4.4 billion, led a staff of 200, helping more than 12,000 homeowners, 1,000 businesses, and 64 communities rebuild following Sandy. She's being joined by our panelists, Shamina Singh, who's the president of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, Leora Clapper, who's the lead economist from the World Bank, and Dr. Michelle Thompson, who's a public interest technology fellow at New America. Please join us on stage, this great group, and welcome them.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Bova-Haight, and as you've heard, I'm joined by Shamina and Michelle and Leora, and we're super excited to talk to you about how data can be used, especially in light of extreme weather events, helping to revitalize communities and using the data for good. So we're going to start with Shamina. For those in the room who are new to the Center for Inclusive Growth, can you share with us a little bit of information about how it was created and how you think about when we talk about the term data for good?
Sure. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming and having me here. I'm really excited to be talking about this issue with such an esteemed group of fellows. So the Center for Inclusive Growth was created in about 2014 as the philanthropic hub for Mastercard. We're an independent subsidiary because we focus a lot on research and what we also call data philanthropy, which is a response to income and information inequality. So the idea that information is something that everyone needs in order to make evidence-based decisions, as we've heard about earlier. So we really created a data philanthropy program to help us get there. And as part of this, we created a new Data Fellows program. As part of that fellowship program, we're inviting some of the brightest minds in the world to come into Mastercard and work with our data scientists side by side in order to uncover trends, impact, insights, patterns that can make sure that as the private sector side of the world sort of races ahead on things like AI and commercialization, that we're also making sure that the information and quality gap that's happening right now in the social sector receives the same level of attention. So that's kind of the scope of work that we're focused on here today, and I'm just delighted to talk more about also what we're doing, unfortunately, around in real time with Hurricane Florence.
Perfect. Michelle and Leora, if you guys could speak just for a little bit about why this type of data philanthropy appealed to the both of you.
Certainly. I'm Michelle Thompson, and thank you so much. I had a passion for, we've heard the term democratization of data, ever since working in Boston as a real estate appraiser, where I found that many of the appraisals in the neighborhoods that were considered low impact were actually higher than neighborhoods that were more stable. And in fact, was able to show through my appraisals that there was an overtaxation, but couldn't prove it. Couldn't get data from the city. The community didn't have the technology or the wherewithal to be able to advance that information. So I set out when I started my PhD to collect the information using floppy disks, and I can see the age in the room. And so that didn't work too well. And as I tell my students now, 5 years of trying to prove a trend when you don't have the technology and the data, I got the PhD, but I didn't prove it. So I have a passion for trying to continue doing that work, and certainly we'll be talking more about how and what I'm doing specifically as we go forward.
Thank you. So I work at the World Bank, although I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not my institution, and believe passionately that you can't solve a problem unless you measure it. And so data really gives us a more nuanced, more complete understanding of the nature of poverty. You know, people often ask me, why aren't you, shouldn't you be studying building schools, giving out mosquito nets, buying people cows? And these are all important, but it's also important to help people understand and better manage their money. I'm often asked, the poor don't have money, isn't that why they're poor? That's not true. The poor have money, they just have less of it. They also tend to have lumpy, unpredictable incomes. Think of farmers who need to stretch their money. They'd only be paid after a harvest, but need to finance their next round of crops, of seeds and fertilizer. And so having a bank account, having access to digital payments, helps poor adults manage their money better, help them build resilience, especially around natural disasters and catastrophes, which we'll discuss.
Well, what's interesting also just to note, in the realm of disaster recovery, disasters don't only hit poor neighborhoods. If you think about Hurricane Sandy, its primary impact was on a very affluent area of southern Long Island. And I think we have to remember when we're talking about recovering from a disaster or using data to help people recover from a disaster, even people that have means, after disaster, it's sort of a free-for-all. You use IRAs, you use savings, you use everything that you have in order to rebuild quicker. So I think sometimes people focus on just LMI communities, but it really affects all demographics. So Leora, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure, and to follow up on your statement, no, exactly. So, most development work on poverty studies how to help the poor pull themselves out of poverty. But there's also a need to understand how to prevent people from falling, from being pushed into poverty when a catastrophe like a natural disaster hits. I grew up in Rockaway Beach, which was devastated by Sandy, so this is very personal research as well. Just looking up this morning, it's estimated that Harvey caused $70 billion worth of damage in that community. And again, so specifically, we're trying to look at, as storms are becoming more frequent and more expensive, what is the financial impact on businesses and on communities? And so specifically looking at how the impact of these catastrophes on small business spending, on consumer spending and borrowing, on the ability to repay loans, on their ability to, on consumption decisions, on healthcare spending, and the such, spending on mortgage, repayments of mortgages, students' loans, and then from the small business perspective, how it affects both their purchasing, their sourcing, as well as their sales and revenue. And so we really hope that our research can help policymakers, businesses, insurers, as well as consumers understand how they can build that resilience to be most prepared for the next disaster. And our partnership will really help us understand not only how this happens, but what we can do to help those most affected.
Okay, great. So when people think about data, generally speaking, they think about long-term planning. But in the context of disaster recovery, can we talk a little bit about examples of how we can use it in the middle or immediately before or immediately after an extreme weather event?
Yeah, I'm just going to, I'd like to jump in just building off both of your comments here because
sure.
I think it's timely. I mean, so we talk about hurricane and tornado. Disasters and shocks are also manufacturing plants closing down in the middle of a town. These are both things, these types of shocks affect generations of the people coming after. And so we have to think about the real time. So in the case of Leora's research around Hurricane Harvey, it's interesting because it's also iterative. One of the insights that we started to work on very quickly when we got a call from General Motors, actually, who said, we have a bunch of people who have OnStar in their cars in Houston, and they're asking us where they can get gas because the oil refineries in Houston, everything shut down. So tough to get gas, tough to figure out where to buy groceries, things like that. So we pulled together a team of our data analysts and scientists, and in 6 hours, we're able to work with General Motors to help inform the drivers about where economic activity was happening. We couldn't necessarily say, look, it's bread and milk, and because we don't do that kind of work. We don't have that kind of insight. But we could say there's activity happening at 7-Eleven. There's activity happening at the Shell gas station on the corner of Park and Main. And so OnStar started telling people where there was economic activity happening, and they could steer them in the right direction. Stepping forward, just unfortunately, because these are happening more and more, we're in the process of doing that right now in real time with Hurricane Florence. But instead of working just with GM and OnStar, we're now working with FEMA to say, look, people are looking for resources. What are the ways that we can help find economic activity faster? And those are the types of insights and patterns that we have to make sure we're using in real time, even as we think about near-term, medium-term, and economic resilience post-recovery.
No, that's a great point. And Michelle, do you want to add to
One of the
that?
things you were talking about, and I think it is important, is the shocks are economic, they're social, and obviously they're short-term and long-term. So some of the work that I've been doing since 2007 was looking at Hurricane Katrina. And of course, there's Katrina fatigue. I understand that. But 13 years later, the lower Ninth Ward has still not fully recovered. It is still being actively reborn, rebirthed. So one of the issues that happened and still is happening is I've been thinking about what is there a way, we have these hurricane preparedness kits, but what about an information hurricane preparedness kit? Because what happened with many of the residents that live there, they pass their homes down through a handshake or an agreement. And any documents that they would have had, which wouldn't have been filed with the city, was washed away. The city had the city records, their birth records washed away. So when it was time for FEMA or HUD to say, we want to help you rebuild, come and give us an ID, show us that you own the home, and we'll give you $150,000 to rebuild. It couldn't happen. So part of it is the man-made disaster pre-Katrina, and even now, trying to figure out how to bring people back when we don't have the database, we don't have the information. So I think those are important issues in terms of that short-term issue. Let's say Hurricane Katrina has had long-lasting effects to this day.
Absolutely. Leora?
I was just going to add, our work is really still ongoing because how important it is. I was talking yesterday with someone, and they're like, well, there are these theories about efficient post-hurricane markets and rational hurricane victims and the market failures. And my perspective is we have real data. And it's not enough to just talk about, well, there's a market failure, but we want to understand, which communities were hit, especially, for example, there's other research looking during political and other economic shocks, the importance of digital payments. When cash becomes more dangerous, more difficult to use, digital payments is often a lifeline for people to make important purchases. There's some evidence that wasn't rigorously done showing, for example, the healthcare spending actually dropped post-Hurricane Harvey. And that sort of goes against expectations. You expect that as people were potentially injured, hurt, there'd be an increase, but it was actually, but then, to understand, what actually happened in these communities, and again, to help policymakers be prepared, help communities be prepared for the next upcoming catastrophe, and have help them build this resilience in advance to be prepared after the disaster hits.
Just to jump in just very quickly, because I think conceptually it's really important to understand that I think one of the reasons why the work that we're all doing on, bringing the fellows into a safe sandbox environment to look at these types of patterns is we have to shrink the time it takes to get from theoretical, economic, rational decision making, the stuff that happens up here, to practical stuff that happens on the ground and go right back up again. And I think that that's the way that we can use, or at least we believe, that's the way we can use real-time information in order to inform what's happening. So to the extent that you've been standardizing 30 years of data and information around real estate, around purchasing and things like that, we're also thinking about how do you redefine purchasing power in these environments? What does it mean to be creditworthy? And so for example, one of the things that's happening in real time in Puerto Rico that we've noticed has been, it's hard to get around. And so in those kinds of situations, anybody can become a driver. Anybody can become a Lyft driver, or they can start to use their assets for economic purposes. And so what's happening is we're seeing an increase in gig work, right? That's happening in Puerto Rico because fleet and transit and all of that's it's gone down. So those are the types of things that you can start to see. What does small business look like? What does creditworthiness look like in a disaster?
Mm-hmm. And I would just love to add that from a disaster recovery perspective, the disaster happens, and Sandy's a great example. So Hurricane Sandy hit New York at the end of October of 2012. We're coming up on the 6th anniversary. And the headlines will be, I can assure you, so spoiler alert, recovery is taking so long. Yeah. The reality is recovery takes time. And to your point that 13 years after Hurricane Katrina, people are still not in the 9th ward. When you're thinking about the influx of money, whether it's from FEMA or from HUD, and the amount of time it takes to do thoughtful rebuilding, right? Let's just not put up exactly what was there before. Let's think about how we're going to do it. It does take a tremendous amount of time. And I think we need to be thoughtful about, we shouldn't just be focused on helping people immediately after the storm, but it could be as long as 15 or 20 years after the storm, and using the data not just from 2 or 3 years after, but 10 or 15 years after. So as somebody who has spent a tremendous amount of time in disaster recovery, most recently in the US Virgin Islands, I wonder whether or not you are using data or comparative data, Sandy as compared to Harvey, as compared to Katrina, or now as compared to Florence. Could you guys talk a little bit about that?
I'm happy to jump in. I think the analysis, the comparison, of course, because what you have to do, or what I think you have to do is you have to sort of look, we can't do these in isolation, right? So it's sort of like, it's the OnStar experience, right? Yes. We saw it, we did it in, in Houston, and then unfortunately we were ready to do it again for Florence, but at a different scale with a government partner, things like that. And I think that's the piece. It's sort of like, that's why all of you know this much better than I do, that all of your work is iterative and you're constantly building on what you learn the first time. And so the trick is going to be, how do we reduce the time it takes to take those lessons and apply them back? And so, and the other thing I'd just like to point out is, I said this earlier, is that economic shocks happen with hurricanes, but they happen with plant closings. And so I'd love to hear about the work in Chicago, but we did a project in the Pullman neighborhood of Chicago's South Side, where we worked with the community who had, this place, this is like Michelle Obama's great-grandfather is from there. It was the first rail car, city in the country. And so it was this booming population that has experienced shocks over as many years, of the 1800s. And so when they had their most recent shock, we worked with the government, and the government came in and sort of injected capital and things like that. But one of the things that they were left with was, what was the impact of all of this? And some of our analytics showed that the increase in digital payment as a proxy for income and as a proxy for ability to spend showed that the ability for people to purchase was there, but you had to bring in a Walmart or a Target or shops and things like that to allow the proximity that a consumer would have to go, the amount of time it would take to actually go buy something. And what that community has seen over the years is an incredible increase in economic resiliency, whether it's small business, transit, and all of the things, and things like that. So being able to tell that story where government comes in, city comes in with funding and things like that, but then you have private sector coming in as a partner, I think it's the relationship that over time creates long-term resiliency.
So part of the work that I do, my day job is as associate professor in the Department of Planning and Urban Studies. But since 2017, 2018, I was given the opportunity to become a New America Public Interest Technology Fellow and supported by Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. So at a university where there's always the opportunity to learn a lot and theorize, but not a lot of funding to be able to support to do real work, that's why I was so excited to be able to say, what can we look at nationwide? Well, after I got the reality check, I said, okay, pick 4 cities. So we started looking at Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, and the Bronx. And my first test was to really look and see what's the information ecosystem. That's a nice way of saying, what is everybody doing to try to really look at what's happening on the ground? Who needs resources? Well, that's 1 year of trying to do some work. And then I said, what I've been working on since being a real estate appraiser, then coming into the university and saying, what is it that I need to teach the students who are going to be going out, becoming the researchers? How do we develop a toolkit so we can evaluate between each city and within the city, collecting data in a standardized professional way? So I am up north, and we started this project called Who Data, but in New Orleans we say Who Data, and it's a public participation geographic information system project where we work with the city and the university with the free labor from the students. And we also then will work with the private sector, limited, of course, until now, and the public sector to figure out ways that we can put data together. So we said, fast forward about 10 years, we now are at a place where we can share the information. That's what I was doing with New America. But in those particular cities, in Chicago and New Orleans, and I'll talk a little bit later about the New Orleans project, we wanted to be able to look at housing starts. We wanted to be able to look at housing education and what impact there was. So using some of the information, looking how we can put together the big data, the demographics, and the community data. We're able to bring that together to have some kind of insights. And so going forward this year, I'm going to be working with the center to really dig deeper on that. So it takes a long time. What I've talked about just now is from 1996 to 2018. It's not a fast process, and I'm getting a little gray. But I think what's really important is the systems, the information, open access, democratizing data. That's what's making the work really be able to be possible.
So yeah, I mean, I could probably start a little bit just by convincing you that, for example, digital payments is far more than a convenience. So for me, it's convenient that on the bus ride home I could order on Amazon my kids' school supplies. But for people in developing countries and even the poor adults living in the U.S., it's a game changer. It's really a life changer. For example, when we talk about shocks, we'll start in developing countries. The Ebola crisis hit Liberia. There were 100,000 medical workers who were going to walk off the job, who were working in these affected communities because they couldn't be paid, because it was too dangerous to bring cash to these areas, both security and health risks. They opened 40,000 bank accounts, mobile money accounts, overnight to pay those workers, which they were able to then digitally transfer to their families, and they stayed on the job. That's a great example. We have examples of just simply building resilience. I've been working in Bangladesh with factory workers who make Zara's, H&M clothing, Marks & Spencer clothing, who are paid in cash. As a woman said to us, my mother-in-law waited outside the gate for me on payday. Now she can't. We started paying them into a bank account. It gives especially women greater privacy, security, and control over her money. And then we did a rigorous impact evaluation. Here again, sharing data with the data in a confidential way, in aggregated, anonymized fashion. We were able to show, and through surveys, that after getting these are randomized control trials relative to workers paid in cash, workers paid into an account. were less, well, savings increased. They were more likely to save the money themselves. And they were more likely to not experience health shocks or income shocks at the end of the month. And yet these workers, 40% at our baseline, told us they go hungry at the end of the month because they can't stretch their money. That number was statistically and largely different, smaller, for those who have these digital payments. I mean, furthermore, these workers, and we see this elsewhere, they garnish wages to take off time, to take buses across town, to wait online, to pay utility bills, school fees. The factories complain they lose all their workers and productivity for 2 days after payday as people are running around the city making these payments. Allowing them to make it mostly from their phone, electronically, allows them to build a greater income, allows them to smooth their income, building this financial resilience which they need to prevent the shocks in the first place. There are many other examples of how we use data to study the impact of shocks, to study improvements in financial resilience. About 9 years ago now, I founded a database called the Global Findex, which I hope many of you are familiar with. It's a global database on how adults in 150 countries make payments, save, borrow, and manage their risks. Collect the data with Gallup around the world. This is demand-side data based on interviews with over 150,000 adults around the world. And we ask them about how they make their payments, how they save. We ask them the question, which has been getting a lot of attention in the US, through other surveys as well. If you had an emergency in the next month, could you come up with, in the US, it's about the equivalent of $2,500 US. Globally, only about half of adults, well, in high-income countries, about 75% of adults, but globally, closer to half of all adults say they can come up with that money. But we're finding evidence that digital payments can help build resilience. There's a great study in Kenya, where I don't know if you're familiar with the M-Pesa, a mobile money product that allows people to cautiously, effortlessly send money from their, I'm using my thumb, their mobile phones. And there's using data from the mobile money provider, again, aggregated, anonymized. Researchers at Harvard and Georgetown were able to show that adults who had access to this mobile money were less likely to suffer shocks. That when an emergency, a health emergency hit, they were more likely to get support, financial support, from a wider both geographic and social network of friends. Now think of the Facebook effect. Suddenly friends further away and socially, further social ring were able to provide them the support that they needed. And so our interest is just broadly looking at how financial products, the design of the appropriate products, the appropriate policies, can help people build the financial resilience to prevent them, hopefully, from falling into poverty when the next shock or catastrophe happens.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
You should talk about what you're, I mean, if you want, in terms
of... You've been waiting. So, again, a lot of the data that I've been working with and the work that I do as a professor is, again, trying to figure out ways to help support nonprofit organizations into getting their data and how they can use it. So as part of the work that I was doing this past year, I've been talking with Neighborhood Development Foundation. And this is a community housing development organization that is now in its 33rd year. The executive director, Fred Johnson, said that 30 years ago he couldn't spell mortgage. He had been in trouble with the law. He would, and when he tells his story, he said he didn't need a mortgage. He was running a gang, came out of jail, and he had somebody who was trying to help change his life. So the idea was, how can we try to train people to change their life through understanding finance? So the organization was set up to just have a housing counseling program and financial fitness or financial education. And since I'd been working with them, I said, how can you tell your story? What is your impact? And they said, well, we don't know. We're just trying to get people housed. And so I knew that there were a lot of paper files. You can imagine 30 years of paper files. What we did was I keep mentioning that I love my students who volunteer, went into their files and turned from paper to Excel spreadsheets, from Excel spreadsheets, made those spatial, and then that map, which you'll be able to see very soon, on Mastercard.com. I'm just kidding.
You won't be able to see it on Mastercard. I'm just-
No, you're not. But you will be able to see it on New America, and you'll be able to look at it on my website. But this map, which is wonderful, shows, and I have to make sure I get my statistics correct here. Out of the 8,551 people who went through the housing counseling program, they had 3,500 homes purchased by people who were unbankable and went to bankable. No or low credit to being credit worthy, according to standard federally insured banks, because NDF, or Neighborhood Development Foundation, does not provide any credit. And the really exciting part about this is that when we took a look at all the purchasing power, there was $223,969,061 of financial impact just from mortgages from one organization. So that model of collecting the information, developing the spreadsheets, this is what was taken to Chicago. So while I was working in New Orleans, I contacted the University of Chicago, and there was a student group called the Tech Team. And they typically make widgets, but I told them, let's do something different. And let's try looking and developing a project. So we used the model that we started in Boston through New Orleans and did the same type of process as we did in New Orleans. One of the biggest problems, again, is time, and only having 16 weeks in a semester. Having a year-long project that we now can use as a model. That organization, Northwest Side Housing, is going to put on a workshop, and they'll be able to show how do we set up the data, because they're not set up. They didn't do their intake based upon what we needed to show these wonderful maps, but they're changing their business practice, and it's information that is private. So these two projects is very different from the standard geographic information, because we really are taking private data and bringing it into the public through a process that we now can teach and support. So this now, P3GIS, a word that I've made up and is now anywhere on Google, public and private participation is the most exciting part for me. That when we walk away, we technologists, we data scientists, community, the community is left with the tools and the resources to tell their own story.
And I just want to put a finer point on this because of the audience that's here today. What she just said is transformational. So think about social sector organizations, right? These people are on the front lines of doing the work that we're all trying to make happen. They're the nonprofits who've been doing this for years, who know what works at the neighborhood level, and their funding is based on impact models, right? So for an organization like the Mastercard Center or any other private company or public, whatever, or government entity, everybody's all about the numbers. Show us what you've done. Prove it. So if you are starting a development association in the south side of Chicago or anywhere, and you're getting your life together, maybe have been incarcerated or whatever, which is increasingly large part of the US population, you've got to have people around you who can help transform your own data from your nonprofit into something that you all will understand, that your audience will look at and say, this is worth funding. $2 million in financial help out of one organization.
223 million.
223. Wow. That story would have never been told had you not come in with your students, right? And so think about the power of that times everybody, even in this room, to retell the story, to shrink the time it takes for social sector organizations to reveal their impact. That's the power, I think, of what at least I'm trying to do and what I think we're all here to try to figure out. So I would just sort of offer this, that we at the Center for Inclusive Growth are looking to partner, fund, incubate, bring into the sandbox, whatever it's going to take to do this kind of work and the kind of work that Leora is also describing all day, every day. And so I think that you are the folks on the front lines who can really help us figure this out. So I welcome, and we welcome, any opportunity to do that.
That's such a good point. Some of my colleagues from the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery are here, and all we focused on was metrics.
Yeah.
metrics, how many people are in, how many people are in the, their homes are being elevated, how many businesses have we helped during a particular moment in time. And quite frankly, HUD, as the funder of our office, was always interested in how much money have you spent, what have you spent it on, and how have you spent it. Right. So the data becomes so important. So that's a really great point, and thank you for that example. So you touched a little bit on creditworthiness and investment worthy. It would be great if we could talk just a little bit about that. Shamina, if you want to start.
Sure. I mean, I think we talked about it before, right? But it's this idea of purchasing power and what does creditworthy really look like and what does it really mean? I mean, and I'm sort of talking about the impact of all of your work. So once you pull all of this information in, to what end? And so this is where it gets to recovery, and this is where it gets to resiliency. Because if I, as a small business owner, can't bring my business back from Hurricane Katrina, or can't start a new business, or can't get another job, what does it mean? And this idea of, and I don't want to forget that Leora's work around what she's just said about cash versus digital payment, because look, I had a student loan coming out of college 150 years ago, and we know this to be true, that most or a lot of people coming out of college, and frankly, a lot of people of limited means, even in the United States, do envelope banking, right? Have y'all done envelope banking? Because I sure did. Okay, you're younger than me, but you're the same generation. But the idea that you would take your grocery money, your rent money, your movie money, whatever that was, and literally stack them up in envelopes. And when you got to the end, and your student loan money, and when you got to the end, you were at the end. And when Leora talked about the purchasing power and the ability of the adults to, what was it, 2,500 US, you all might recall a study in the United States that said 40%, I think, is it 40% of adults can't raise, are $400 away from crisis. $400 away from crisis. So these are all stories that these data scientists and you all are uncovering using data from organizations like private sector organizations, but in partnership to uncover the patterns, uncover the insights, uncover the actionable insights that we can work with government entities, private sector entities to actually do something about it.
I think the issue for creditworthiness and, when you started talking about the student loans, I think one of the biggest problems that I've been seeing, because another part of the project that I was looking at was what happens when your credit becomes bad and it follows you for a very long time. So one of the issues in Chicago and also St. Louis that we were looking at is, and of course New York, what are some alternatives? So I know the comptroller, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the report, but the City of New York comptroller did a study to look at, is it possible that we can look at rent payments and the patterns of the rent payments as an alternative to credit? So you can base your history on that. And would that be more beneficial for people who aren't creditworthy, don't have a credit card? And that would be another, instead of a proxy, you'd be able to show that you can pay your rent at $500 and $600 a month. Of course, that would be great, but if you're trying to get a mortgage and then you've been paying, on the opposite, $1,200 a month. Of course, I'm not from New York City because this probably sounds really low. But the idea is that there's alternative ways of establishing credit. So that's another piece of what this research is about, is what other alternative ways, what kind of different type of data can we show, especially in cash economies?
Yeah, I just mentioned that. So it's again interesting how much the U.S. is often learning from innovation in developing countries, which often are, in a sense, leapfrogging, or just by necessity. And so the use of what we call alternative credit information is one of the most exciting innovations in developing countries, where people less likely to have any physical assets, like a home. If they do, there may not be a good collateral registry to actually use that as collateral. People are less likely to have any sort of formal credit. According to Findex, less than 10% of adults globally actually have a formal loan. but you're a business owner, and there's a shock, and you need to borrow some money to start or grow your business, or a health emergency, or your home is devastated in a flood, you want to rebuild. What they're using now is what we call reputational collateral. If you don't have an alternative to physical collateral, and that's simply payment history. And again, another benefit of paying these women workers and garment workers into their account is a regular payment is a really good predictor that you can make a monthly payment on credit. And so using money coming in wage payments, or even business people, their money coming in, as well as bill payments going out. If you're able to pay utility bills on a regular basis, phone bills, your mobile phone bills, et cetera, that's a really good predictor in helping people get credit in times of emergency. I'd also mention one other group of, especially here in New York, a group of people who are often facing shocks, which are migrants, trying to send money back home. And increasingly, at least, especially in some overseas markets, it's really expensive, if not risky, to send money. The World Bank has a recent report, I got the number, that we could reduce costs of international remittances by just 5%. We'd say the recipients would make $16 billion additional dollars would go back to the home countries. And that's money again. So this plays into both conversations. One, certainly this money is helping communities. And certainly after, currently in Asia, any sort of natural disaster, climate-related catastrophes in emerging markets, we know remittances home goes back up. And secondly, this is also being used as credit information. There are many markets where if you show a regular remittance payment coming, for example, from the Middle East back to some markets in Asia, that can be used as collateral for a loan to buy property or land or improve your home. And so, digitizing the ecosystem in a safe, responsible way to increase the availability of appropriate credit is very much an outcome of the development of the digital payment ecosystem.
So I wanted to just add that in terms of businesses and in terms of shocks, I was talking to, it's my favorite restaurant, Slim Goodies on Magazine Street, if you ever come to New Orleans. And she was saying that there's going to be, about 60% of the city is undergoing different types of street repairs. The business was given one notice that for 3 months, this particular corner of St. Charles and Magazine was going to be shut down. Again, I'm not a business owner, so I understand it was going to be difficult. I wouldn't get my sweet potato pancakes when I wanted them. But the idea that this business owner was not given enough time to be able to say, in the next 3 months, I've got to adjust the workers who are cash. I've got to adjust how much I have just stated I'm going to purchase in terms of whatever it is, the étouffée. And the idea of being able to have enough money and to be able to go to a bank for even an interim loan, whatever that might look like, all becomes a shock to the workers, to their families, to folks who are trying to get to the business who weren't properly notified. So I think those are some of the things when we keep talking about big data issues, we've got to bring it down to some basic
we did a study
issues.
on the city bikes, right? So we did a study that showed your business proximity to a city bike location, what that impact was on your business. So it was interesting because, and you can look at it, and I have to say this because my social media person is here. If you go to mastercardcenter.org, you can see our city bike study that showed the impact of proximity to a city bike in terms of the types of products that were bought and sold and things like that. But at a very high level, the rate of growth and increase and decrease geographically by the shops closer or further away from a city bike, which helps investment, right? So then you want to tell the mayor and you want to talk to people and say, look, if these are actually economic growth pods. And what we're also seeing is the increase and decrease in the new internet hubs that the payphones have become. So your ability to plug in to a payphone makes a difference in terms of the small businesses around there. So if we're telling hot dog carts or food trucks, where do you want to park? You want to park near one of those wireless charging stations. So your business will go up or down based on how far you are potentially from one of these wireless charging. And the third thing is we also looked at the 2nd Street subway, the impact of building the 2nd Street subway and what that was like on businesses who to your
Second
point,
Avenue.
had to,
Second Avenue subway.
Second Avenue. So what was I, Second Street?
Second Street, yeah.
Yeah. I'm from Austin,
Avenue.
too.
It's
I have
okay.
to tell
It's
everyone
all
else.
good.
6th Street in Austin. But the Second Avenue subway, in terms of what the business impact was there. So you can start to see that, you know, these concepts have to go from here, and actually their impact is
And-
right down on the front lines.
And even to take that a step further, we're working in an Asian market with data from a ride-sharing company to go even beyond just economic activity to show a direct impact on employment, especially for women who may not be able to work certain hours because it's not safe for them to get to their location. And these ride-sharing companies are enabling them to affordably get to work and work longer hours and better hours and earn more. And so, exactly, the data is being used not only to show the economic importance on economic growth, but also on employment and improving people's lives.
And I have two short follow-ups. It turns out that after I read the study about the bikes, I was talking to my students, and they said, oh, the City of New Orleans just started a collaboration with Blue Bikes, try to improve health. And so I started looking around at where the Blue Bikes landed and the stations where they put the bicycles. Not one of the Blue Bikes is in the lower 9th Ward. And most of the people there, a lot of the city, they take bikes. But the more practical thing, again, I thought, what a lofty, what a wonderful study. But it came down to something very basic. You go for a bike ride, wherever you get off, you're hungry, thirsty, tired, right? So the idea that even if it was near an area or a neighborhood, there are going to be other businesses that are going to start coming there because they know or will see that there's some economic investment happening. So that was really wonderful to really take that idea back. And I know a lot of this discussion has been about national, but I'm really glad you're bringing up international because one of the other hats, and my husband will not be happy if I don't mention our nonprofit, Crossworld Africa. And that's what this handmade. We help with microfinance. We help purchase cows for women. And one of the issues was women who were in the Rift Valley being able to have their cell phone, being able to purchase goods and services. That has made a critical difference. So I really appreciate what you've been saying about that because as a nonprofit, we're able to see how important it is of the work that you're doing. And I know Mastercard's been doing work in Kenya as well to help the families. And that's what's been my driving force of a lot of the work that I
Well,
do.
unfortunately, we are out of time. I feel like we could discuss this for another 5 hours. At least I know that I could. So, but thank you, Shamina and Michelle and Leora. This was really so interesting. And I think if you take anything away, clearly using the data for good, for help both in the short term and in the long term after an extreme weather event or in an economic downturn is really transformative. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.